Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus, coming at you with kind of a free-form discussion about the best deck in the standard format, Sultai Ultimatum. As a friendly reminder, if you do like informative content for MTG Arena, whether it be standard or historic, please consider subscribing to the channel, as we aim to be the most informative channel on YouTube. So hit that intro. So starting out first with Sultai Ultimatum itself, brief discussion about what the deck actually tries to do. If you're new to Standard or just getting back into the format, Emergent Ultimatum is kind of been the de facto best deck since all of the bannings, and even before Strixhaven came out, it was kind of the de facto best deck. I mean, there are ways to beat it. You can go under it, you can go over it. We'll talk about that in a second. But basically, you're trying to cast the card Emergent Ultimatum, which allows you to search your card for 3 monocolored spells, reveal them, your opponent chooses one, that goes back and shuffled back into your library, and then you get to cast the other 2 spells. So generally, you're trying to get some type of game-breaking effect, or you're trying to dig for a bunch of answers to a particular situation. This card is kind of multifaceted in what it can do. It can be a game winner, where you can put yourself so far ahead your opponent has no chance of coming back, or it can be a stabilizer in lieu of other bombs later on that allow you to kind of win the game. There's a myriad of different spells this card can go get, but the main thing with this deck is it is a semi-ramp control deck using things like Wolfwallow Haven, Cultivate, Binding of the Old Gods, and there are some other cards that we can get to and some other examples. But these are the main 3 ramp spells that you'll see in almost every variant of the deck. And then your bombs are generally things like Kiora the Sea God, which creates a crack and allows you to steal something your opponent controls. Alron's Epiphany to take extra turns. Professor Onyx is a new one since Strixhaven came out. Allows you to kind of take over the game. Its ultimate isn't necessarily game-winning, but it is definitely backbreaking. Forces your opponent to discard all their cards, or they take a bunch of life loss. And then some of the versions, most of the versions actually play Vorinclex, which makes Kiora the Sea God, Professor Onyx, and the flip side of Valky, God of Lies, Tibble Cosmic Imposter, come down basically ultimate right away, putting you incredibly far ahead, and from there it's usually trivial to win the game. Alternatively, you have an answer pile of like Shadow's Verdict, Extinction Event, and some type of removal spell. Say you're up against like Mono Red or Mono White, or possibly even Fae, not Dimir Fae, Dimir Rogues, not Dimir Fae. Fae was the original tempo kind of tribal deck, but allows you to go get answers to stabilize the board, and then hopefully to either draw in, or if you happen to have drawn one of your other big bombs, allows you to like stabilize the board, then untap the following turn, and then try to take over the game from there. So kind of like I said, a very multifaceted card, but it is still a 7 mana sorcery. The mana can be tricky with the 3 green, 2 blue, and 2 black. Beyond that, this deck does play a lot of the multifaceted cards. You play things like Jawari Disruption, Palaka Predation, and Seagate Restoration as ways to increase your land count while still not flooding out with the needing spells in the mid-game, as this is a ramp deck that can flood out a little bit. And then finally, you are a Yorion deck. You have a little bit of a package of things like Omen of the Sea, Elcess Nightmare, Binding of the Old Gods, potentially resetting things like Pelucranos. So a lot of and even Kiora the Sea God in some spots. Can reset a Professor Onyx if you've had to downtick for some reason. So this deck does a lot of different things, but it's not the best Yorion deck, and it's not the best ramp deck, but this card kind of ties its all strategy together. As far as the getting to the strategy besides the ramp deck, you have a lot of interaction. This version's running things like Heartless Act, Jawari Disruption. Mystical Dispute is mainly a metagame call, because there is a lot of blue decks in the format, whether it be some of the variants of the adventure decks, the Is It Dragons decks, the aforementioned Rogues decks, etc. It does behoove people to play Mystical Dispute. Elcess Nightmare is another multifaceted card that is once again a bit of a meta call. This often comes down and kills a rogue, and then strips away their End of the Story or key counter spell. This is a card that's also decent against Mono Red, comes down and kills a creature, can take away their Ember Cleave. Blocker Predation, this is a card you can go grab when you're casting your own Immersion Ultimatum to keep your opponent from casting one on you the following turn. And then finally, Pelucranos and Elder Gargaroth are kind of your stabilizing big bodies, in addition to all your sweepers and removal spells. Pelucranos also serves double duty as an escape card against rogues, kind of shrinking your graveyard. And then Elder Gargaroth, very powerful card that mono red, mono white, etc. must answer in order to attack through generally. And these two cards also do a double duty of sometimes winning a beatdown game plan in some of the post-board games where Emergent Ultimatum is much more difficult to cast. As far as the sideboard options, a lot of the sideboards are the same. Obviously, you have Urion in your sideboard. Then you have like some type of anti-spell measures, whether it be duresses or more counter spells. You know, things like Disdainful Stroke, Mystical Dispute, Negate, etc. Additional copies of Elder Gargaroth for the aggressive matchups, as well as copies of Eliminate. Mazemind Tome is often a card used in a lot of these variants in order to, in the more grindy matchups when you're not necessarily going to just ramp into Immersion Ultimatum and win the game. Eureka Moment is a card that we'll discuss in one of the other versions that I've played. Is one of the other potential ramp spells you can play. And then, that's pretty much this version. This one was by Dukat, a noted MTGO grinder. So this is the one version I have not actually played yet, and I did find it interesting that he chose to forego Vorinclex. As far as the deck, there's 5 creatures, a bunch of other things, and only really Professor Onyx is from the new set, I do believe, from Strixhaven itself. And then beyond that, another thing to notice about the land base is some amount of temples, how many basics you're choosing to run because of Cultivate and Fabled Passages. And then most versions run at least one version of Ketria Triome to be able to hard cast Tybalt Cosmic Imposter, should you happen to draw the card. And most of the time you fetch this up with your Binding of the Old Gods if you already have your black mana set up. Beyond that, some of the versions since Strixhaven have tried out the Snarls and such. So a lot of the parts of the deck are kind of set in stone. Things like Omen of the Sea, Heartless Act in some number, Wolf Willow Haven, Cultivate, some number of Sweepers, some number of Binding of the Old Gods, some number of Elder Gargaroths, and then your bombs can vary. Elrond's Epiphany has kind of become a 2 of in a lot of versions. Beyond that, like Seagate Restoration sometimes is a 1 of, Kiora Sea God. There's a certain core that we'll cover as we cover the 3 different versions of the deck that I'm going to be taking a look at. But most of it is all about game number 1, trying to resolve Immersion Ultimatum and win the game from there. Your strategies in game 2, game 3 can change a little bit. Sometimes you're trying to force through the combo. Sometimes there are alternative win cons that some people bring from the sideboard that we'll cover in a couple of the other versions. So, just wanted to take a look at one of the kind of the baseline versions of the deck without a Vorinclex, kind of being the one notable exception from this version that's not being played. That said, let's take a look at a couple of the versions that I have been playing recently. Alright, taking a look at the version that I've been playing on the ladder the most. This variant, obviously, a little bit different than Dukat's version that we were taking a look at. The main thing, obviously, being is Vorinclex. This allows you to combo with Professor Onyx if it happens to be running it in your version. This version does not. We do still have Valky, God of Lies, and Kiora Sea God, both of which come down and double up. Another huge thing about Vorinclex is it makes your opposing Immersion Ultimatums much worse because of the half the number of counters clause. So it makes things like Valky and Professor Onyx and any type of Saga. The Sagas don't trigger at all, so Vorinclex is actually very good in the mirror, but I've actually found it to be quite in a lot of other situations. Like, yeah, it's a 6/6 trample haste, but a lot of times, especially in the mirror matches where you're really worried about it, Heartless Act deals with it really efficiently. So I can kind of understand Dukat kind of cutting that out. Another card, wanting one less Elspeth's Nightmare than Gull was, as well as one less Mystical Dispute. It's probably more of a meta call, as his list was from a preliminary online, which tends to be high-level grinders that play only the top tier meta decks against each other. And then another thing to look at in this version is Quandrix Cultivator, which is a 3/4 Turtle Druid whenever it comes into play. Again, the basic island or forest, put it into play. Most notably untapped, which does allow you to play this and then hold up something like a Mystical Dispute, which can be quite nice. You know, we're still running the 2 Polukranos, the 2 Elder Gargaros, and then this version's running 4 Sweepers against the aggressive decks, which I've seen quite a bit of on the ladder. Another thing is you'll see a shift in the amount of removal spells, trying to have some early interaction to get to your either ramp spells or sweepers, and then 2 Jawari Disruption seems to be the main thing. Once again, no snarls in this particular version. A little bit higher on the number of basics because we're running Quandrix Cultivator in addition to Cultivate. As far as the sideboard, you know, a lot of it is the same. One thing in this version you'll notice is Test of Talents, which is very good against both the Sultai Ultimatum combo as well as knocking out into the story in the Rogues decks. Karavik the Spiteful is another sideboard card that sees popping up. -1/-1. There's a lot of creatures that are die to -1/-1. Elrond's Epiphany tokens, a lot of the creatures in mono red, a lot of creatures in mono white. Some of the rogues even die to this, so quite a powerful thing. Some people are running 1, some people are running 2. I don't know where I fall on that one yet. And then the other sideboard tech that we didn't mention in the original deck tech that we were talking about was Cosmos Serpent. So there are a couple ways to attack the Sultai Ultimatum deck. The main ones are going under it with something like mono red, mono white, just killing them before they can get set up. The other way is kind of playing a tempo game where you get some creatures down, put some pressure on the board, and then counter everything they do. Coma allows you to have a huge uncounterable threat that your opponent has to have an instant Heartless Act or an Extinction Event, or this card's just going to threaten to take over the game with a 3/3 every turn. Literally every turn, not just your upkeep, but also during your opponent's upkeeps. So this is one of the cards that often comes in when you're boarding down on copies of Emergent Ultimatum when you're think you're going to be facing Test of Talents and such. Once again, the full package is Duresses, Elspeth's Nightmares, the full 4 Eliminates between the main and the side, 3rd copy of Elder Gargaroth for the aggressive decks. So that was the main thing I wanted to mention in these ones was the addition of Quandrix Cultivator. No Professor Onyx in this one, but there is a Warren Collects. And then Coma is definitely a sideboard tech that I've been noticing a lot. Let's take a look at the final version that I used to go 6-1 in the Standard Challenge a couple weeks ago. Alright, we're going to take a look at the third version, the second version of the ones that I've been playing. It's a little bit different in what it was trying to execute. This was basically a little bit after Strixhaven was released. So there's a little bit more experiment going on with this version. Things like Eureka Moment. Quite an interesting card. Draw 2, you can put a land in your play. It's like a kind of doubled up mana version of Growth Spiral without putting 2 lands in play. Once again, much like the copy of Cultivix Cultivator or Quandrix Cultivator. It was just another pseudo ramp spell you can use to get to your point where you're casting your big dumb spells. Beyond that, notable things about this version: only 3 copies of Wolf Willowhaven. Not a huge fan of that. I do like the 4/4 of the Cultivate, but still an interesting thing. Once again, a couple copies of Eliminate along with a couple copies of Jawari Disruption. 3 copies of Mystical Dispute here. Only 3 sweepers in the main, in the spot where a lot of the decks have been running Extinction Event. You've been running. This version runs Asika's Chariot, which puts 2 2/2s into play, which is obviously a nice blink target with Urion. Plays a little bit more to Urion. Only 3 copies of the Binding of the Old Gods. 2 copies of Polukranos. Like I said, a lot of these versions are either running 1 or 2 Polukranos, usually 1 in the main, 1 on the side, or 2 in the main. And then, obviously, this is the first version we've seen with both Professor Onyx and Warren Clax. 2 copies of Elrond's Epiphany, once again, kind of the big thing here. 1 copy of Quiorbus the Sea God. 2 copies of Seagate the Restoration. Once again, this is kind of the modal version. It can be a land and a spell. This version was also trying out a couple of Snarls. 1 Necro Blossom and 2 Vine Glimmer. Was not too impressed with the Snarls. A lot of times they come into play tapped. One card that is interesting to explore is the copy of World Tree. This basically means if you have 6 or more lands in play, your spells can cast anything in your deck. The only thing it can go fetch in this version is Valky, God of Lies, and only cast the Valky side. So maybe there is like some exploration you can do with like some of the other gods. Maybe have them kind of an alternative win con or something. But this version was very impressive to me in the run that I went on. Once again, 6-1 in the Standard Meta Challenge, like a couple weeks after Strixhaven released. Sideboard, nothing too noticeable here. Only 3 copies of Duress, a couple copies of Elspeth's Nightmare, along with this one. I think 2 to 3 ones. Elspeth's Nightmare not only good, decent against mono red and rogues, it's also pretty good against the cycling decks, exiling their graveyard. It can also be like a delayed Duress or Thoughtseize for things like Immersion Ultimatum, or against the rogues deck taking their in the story. Also additional sweepers in the form of Shadow's Verdict. So a lot of different things going on. I'm not going to talk about the version, the blend that I would build to try to get this to the best of its abilities for the ladder from what I've seen on the ladder, as we've been kind of trying to bounce around between Diamond 2 and Diamond 3 quite a bit with this deck. Haven't really gotten a lot of traction. Haven't really had a lot of wins in a row. Haven't really had a lot of losses in a row. But we are going to take a look at a couple other alternative versions of Sultai that have sprang up over the last several months in order to kind of maybe take a different approach to this deck, or just be a different deck altogether. One version is kind of a version without Immersion Ultimatum, and it's just kind of a deck that's a little bit better against the aggressive decks, but sacrifices some of the late game power. And the other version is kind of like a brute force version of this deck without the ultimatums, to kind of brute force a bunch of powerful spells through and kind of go over the top of one of the other strategies to counter this deck. Like I said, there is 2 main ways to attack this deck. The first one is with counter spells and pressure, either some type of your own combo, or like with dragons or rogues, backing it up, putting pressure on, countering a couple key spells before it can resolve one and win the game, or to go under them with something like mono red before it can get set up. So that's it. We're going to take a look at the other combo version of this deck that's not running Ultimatum, that's running Titan's Nest as a way to jumpstart and cast a bunch of spells and kind of brute force your way through what the opponent's trying to do. And the other version is a controlling deck, which will be the very last one that we cover. It's kind of a Sultai Ultimatumless control deck. Alright, taking a look at the Sultai Titan's Nest deck. So when I said this was kind of an Ultimatum deck, it doesn't run Ultimatum, but what instead it tries to do is just tries to run brute force spells of Alron's Epiphanies and Shark Typhoons, just kind of win the game. So you still have a lot of the late game hammers, but without like the flexibility that Immersion Ultimatum allows you to get. At the flip side is you run this card Titan's Nest. So beginning the upkeep, look at your top card of your library, you can put this card in your graveyard. Kind of a sort of front half of the Search for Azcanta thing, but the second line here is exile a card from your graveyard, add 1 colorless mana. Spend this mana only to cast a spell that's 1 or more colors without X in its mana cost. So basically, you're turning your graveyard into a turbo resource to turbo out Shark Typhoon, Professor Onyx, Alron's Epiphany, and just kind of like brute forcing a bunch of big spells through the game. So a lot of these decks that like attack the Ultimatum deck, play things like Goldspan Dragon or Bone Crusher Giant, those kind of things, and try to tempo you out with counter spells, or the Rogues deck that maybe plays like a Drown in the Lock or a Mystical Dispute, holding it up while trying to like kind of tempo and pressure you out. This deck basically tries to resolve Titan's Nest, which obviously 4 mana is a lot easier to resolve than 7 mana before your opponent can get set up. Especially in the main deck, you only have a couple counter spells with things like Mystical Dispute. But basically, you just try to force your opponent. You force this card through, you get an overwhelming mana advantage, and the rest of the deck is set up trying to get this card into play and then cast some amount of these amount of spells. So you're using things like strategic planning. Look at the top 3, put 1 in your hand, the rest in your graveyard. Thirst for Meaning. Draw 3, discard 2 unless you discard an enchantment. or Ray of Revelation, draw 3, then discard a card. It's basically you're putting all these cantrips and discarding cards in your graveyard to set up, trying to find your Titan's Nest, casting your Titan's Nest, and then just hammering your opponent with these big spells. Like I said, this is a little bit better against something like the Goldspan Dragon version, the Is It Tempo version, but, you know, opponents milling you with the rogues allows you to cast a bunch of big spells, potentially winning the game that way. You're using a lot of the same spells to stay alive, Eliminate and Heartless Act, as well as Nightmare, Extinction Event, and Shadow's Verdict. One thing you're missing from this version, you're not running the ramp spells, but your cantrips that are allowing you to find your combo pieces are also the things that are allowing you to fill up your graveyard and eventually ramp out a bunch of spells with Titan's Nest. So the one vulnerability is, you know, while Test of Talents can't hit the Titan's Nest, can hit, you know, your Alrund's Epiphany, which is your main way to win the game outside of Shark Typhoons, obviously making either big sharks or hard casting Shark Typhoon and using your spells to make a bunch of things. Mana's a little bit better because you don't have to sneak that red in there. You do need a little bit more untapped mana, but, you know, you're not really starting on things till 2, much like the other deck. But, you know, you're not really ramping much. This version's running a single Cultivate. You don't even necessarily need that. You could run like the fourth one of these, another copy of Elsa's that, or a third Mystical Dispute. Basically, this deck's a little bit even more set in stone than the Ultimatum deck, but, you know, it approaches things from a slightly different version. Whether this version's better or worse, kind of hard to say. I haven't played with it nearly as much as I have the Ultimatum decks. One thing a lot of decks run that do this is they can run Kahira, because you're not running any creatures in the main deck. This particular version doesn't, but it does run a bunch of creatures in the sideboard. Once again, duresses to force through your spells, eliminate, kind of stem the tide against the other aggressive decks, negates and mystical disputes, play against the other counterspell heavy decks, you know, rogues and Izzet mainly. A couple copies of Elder Gargaroth, which are both pretty good against Izzet and pretty good against the aggressive decks. Karavik the Spiteful, as we've mentioned, this is a card that's come in a lot against a lot of the aggressive decks. And then Pelucranos Unchained, once again, card that's pretty good against rogues, also pretty good. It's just a big butt against any type of aggressive decks. Another deck I have seen popping up a little bit, at least on the ladder, since I've been playing it the last several days a little bit more, trying to get ready for these videos, was Mono Green Dudes, which is basically, you know, trying to run Gem Razor and a bunch of just like big green beats with the Great Henge. You know, sometimes that deck is brute force, and sometimes it's nice to just put a big body in front of their big bodies, kind of let you stabilize until you can get going with your game plan. But this was the 4th of the 5th decks we were going to take a look at. Next, we're going to take a look at just a controlling deck, which is a little bit better against the aggressive decks, a little bit better against maybe adventurers, but a little bit weaker against the mirror matches and stuff, which we'll get into when we start covering it. Alright, finally we're back for the last deck. This particular version is by Bruno Oliveira, Oliveira. It's a version that I've tried out a little bit on the ladder, and while I don't have as much in-depth detail about this one as I do about Ultimatum, a couple things to consider about this is this version was built to be better against the aggressive decks like Mono Red, Mono White, and also a little bit better maybe against some of the versions of the adventure decks. So one thing you'll notice about this version, there's no ultimatums, no Titan's Nests. This is a pure mid-range control deck. Your top end, Coma, obviously somewhat difficult creature to answer. There are things that can kill it, Heartless Act before it can play a token, or in response to the token during the upkeep. Extinction Event. You know, there are things that can deal with this card. Combination of cards, etc. Elder Gargaroth, 4 of. This card is very good against Mono Red, decent against Mono White, pretty decent against Teamer, Gruul, basically anything that's not playing black. In the mirror match, it often dies to Heartless Act. And while you can potentially tempo out with this one, Coma's obviously your best threat in the pseudo mirrors or against rogues and stuff. Shadow's Verdict, Extinction Event, more sweepers in the deck. definitely this deck is hard geared towards beating the aggressive decks. Pelucranos, another big butt you can put in front of creature decks. Escape Claw is very relevant against rogues. Generally, this deck has a better top end against specifically aggressive decks. Quandrix Cultivator, 4 of, is a 3/4 body. Pretty good source of card advantage, allows you to put a land into play, ramping towards your other big plays while also putting a body that your opponent must deal with. Buying the Old Gods, almost all the greatest hits. One thing you'll notice about this version, no copies of Cultivate. You're only ramping this version on the lower end at least is Wolf-Willow Haven, in addition to your incidental ramp from buying the Old Gods and Quandrix Cultivator. A little bit more permission, couple copies of Hard Counters and Saw It Coming, 3 copies of Mystical Dispute, couple copies of Elsewest Nightmare, and then more spot removal in the main deck than some of the other versions are willing, and then a couple copies of Jawari's Disruption. As far as your Urion package, you have some copies of Omen of the Sea. Buying the Old Gods, you can blink Pelucranos. Not as much to blink with Urion. Obviously, Quandrix Cultivator can be pretty decent, but sometimes getting lands is just getting lands, especially if you're not running any of the big bombs at the top end. You don't have a ton to do with your mana once you cast a Coma and such. Sideboard, you'll notice a lot of the same cards, Duresses for a lot of the same matchups, mirror matches, control decks, etc. Extinction Event against creature decks, Karavik the Spiteful, once again you'll notice a couple copies of Negate and Test for talents, as well as the 4th copy of Mystical Dispute. A couple copies of Lovestruck Beast, both against the aggressive decks and as kind of a earlier aggression play against some of the other combo decks. The one thing I will say about this version, it's definitely better against the aggressive decks. You have a lot more things they must answer, a lot more early to the board plays. You're not necessarily having to wait on a 7 mana card to kind of take over the game. However, without also a couple ways of Maze Mind Tome in the main deck, without some type of big hammer, your top end doesn't necessarily win you the game. So if your opponent answers your 1 or 2 threats, especially in the Sultai Mirrors or against a control deck or against rogues, if your opponent answers your 1 or 2 threats, oftentimes they have better over-the-top plays. Like if you're not able to duress away their over-the-top play or negate their End of the Story or Sultai Ultimatum, you're going to lose the game. This deck does not play the over-the-top game particularly well. It more tries to take a big tempo role in a lot of those matchups. Resolve a Gargaroth, resolve a Coma, resolve a Pelucranos, beat down for a couple turns, try to counter a couple keep spells, and just win the game. But oftentimes those decks have enough answers to your threats and enough big hammers that you run into some problems. So that's one thing I've noticed with this version. It is definitely better against the aggressive decks, but a little bit worse in the mirror match situations against like Titan's Nest, against Ultimatum. So while it still has a very good top end, it's not as good as Ultimatum. As far as the video, that's kind of going to be a wrap for this video. Next video, I'm going to work on my process of trying to synchronize the list to try to find a list that I particularly like before we get into some playing videos. I'm going to run it through like a bunch of different matches in the ladder in an effort to kind of see, how the version that I come up with from the versions of the Ultimatum decks that we saw. I've been running into a lot of mono red, some mono green. Haven't run into a ton of adventures. I've run into some rogues, run into some mirror matches. So really the meta is like skewed towards aggressive decks and Ultimatum decks and a little bit of rogues, so I'm going to keep that in mind, at least on the diamond ladder where I've been at. Maybe it's a little bit different in the mythic or in the platinum meta, so just keep that in mind. Things obviously change a little bit as you're like going up or down the ladder, but just wanted to take a look at a couple alternative versions of the deck in addition to kind of the breakdown that we did for Ultimatum itself. There's a reason why it's the best deck in the format, and these versions aren't quite as well known or fleshed out maybe. They try to improve on some strengths, but they also have their weaknesses as well. This version can have gone over the top. The Titan's Nest version has a lot of the same problems as the Ultimatum deck, in addition to the fact that you're like not milling yourself, but like drawing a bunch of cards more makes you even more vulnerable to rogues' mill out strategy. So each deck has its own little quirks and weaknesses, you know, what bombs you play, etc., etc. We'll get into that as we try to kind of distill down into a version that I'm going to be trying to play in some matches. I'm not going to just do raw gameplay. I'm going to try to break it down into like key matchups, like if I can find enough adventurous decks, if I can find enough mono red mirror matches, etc. I'm going to try to play a bunch of matches and just try to break it down by matchup rather than just like playing raw gameplay. So this is try to be a little bit more informative and a little bit more useful to people. If you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel, because I'm going to try to do these long form discussions after I've played the decks some, and then try to do, you know, a little bit of breakdown and matchups and stuff. So this has been John from MTG Nexus. Hope you enjoyed the video.